The cockpit was shaking so violently that Captain Bill Weaver could barely read the instruments in front of him. His state Route 71 Blackbird was tearing through the sky at 85,000 feet, moving faster than a bullet, faster than sound itself. The air outside was so thin, it was almost like being in space. Inside his pressure suit, sweat was running down his face. Something was terribly wrong. The plane lurched sideways without warning. Bill's head slammed against the canopy so hard he saw stars. Metal screamed. The right engine had exploded. Fire warning lights covered the instrument panel like angry red eyes. His backseater, Jim Zwayer, was shouting something through the radio, but the words were lost in the roar of wind and failing systems. The Blackbird was breaking apart around them at 3 times the speed of sound. Bill reached for the ejection handle between his legs. His hands were shaking. In all his years of flying, through combat missions and test flights that pushed the limits of what machines could do, he had never ejected from an aircraft. Now he had no choice. The State Route 71 was tumbling end over end. The G-forces were crushing him into his seat. His vision was turning gray at the edges. He pulled a handle. Nothing happened the way it was supposed to happen. In a normal ejection, explosive charges blow the canopy away. Rockets fire beneath the seat, launching the pilot clear of the aircraft. The whole process takes less than 2 seconds. But there was nothing normal about ejecting from a plane that was disintegrating at Mach 3.2. Bill Weaver was about to become the first person in history to survive something that should have been absolutely impossible. The Blackbird tore itself into pieces. One moment Bill was sitting in a cockpit. The next moment there was no cockpit. There was no plane. There was only screaming wind and violent tumbling and the realization that he was no longer strapped to anything. The ejection seat had separated, but Bill didn't remember it happening. He didn't remember the parachute deploying. He didn't remember anything except the sensation of his body being ripped apart by forces no human being was ever meant to experience. The air at 85,000 feet is so thin that water boils at room temperature. The pressure is so low that human blood can actually boil inside your veins. The temperature is 70 degrees below zero. Bill's pressure suit was the only thing keeping him alive, but the suit was never designed for this kind of abuse. He was tumbling through the sky like a rag doll, spinning so fast that up and down had no meaning. The G-forces were incredible. His arms and legs whipped around his body with enough force to break bones. Time became strange. Bill's brain was starved for oxygen. His inner ear, which told him which way was up, had completely failed. He was somersaulting through frozen sky, and he couldn't tell if he was falling or flying or already dead. His last clear thought before he blacked out was about Jim. His backseater, his friend. Was Jim okay? Had Jim ejected? The questions faded as darkness took over. When Bill woke up, he was still falling. His parachute had deployed somehow. He was drifting down through clear blue sky. He couldn't feel his hands. He couldn't feel his feet. Everything hurt in a distant, muffled way, like the pain was happening to someone else. He looked up at the white canopy above him and couldn't understand how it got there. He didn't remember pulling the ripcord. His pressure suit had done it automatically when he reached a lower altitude. The ground was coming up fast. Bill tried to prepare for landing, but his body wouldn't respond properly. His left hand wasn't working. His back felt wrong, like bones had moved to places they shouldn't be. He hit the New Mexico desert hard, tumbling across rocks and sand. The parachute dragged him for 50 feet before the wind finally died. He lay there, staring up at the sky, breathing air that tasted like dust and blood. A farmer found him 20 minutes later. The man was driving his truck across his property when he saw the parachute spread out like a giant white flower in the desert. He ran over, expecting to find a body. Instead, he found Bill Weaver, still alive, still conscious, trying to sit up even though his body was broken in a dozen places. "Don't move," the farmer said. His voice was shaking. "Just stay still. I'm calling for help." "Jim," Bill whispered. His lips were cracked and bleeding. "My backseater. Did you see another parachute?" The farmer looked at the empty sky. He looked at the scattered pieces of the state Route 71 burning across 5 miles of desert. He shook his head slowly. Bill closed his eyes. The rescue helicopter arrived at 3:47 p.m. Paramedics loaded Bill onto a stretcher. His pressure suit had saved his life, but it was shredded in places, torn by the violence of his tumble through the upper atmosphere. His face was swollen. His eyes were bloodshot from burst capillaries. Every breath felt like knives in his chest. They gave him morphine, but he fought to stay awake. "Jim Zwayer," he kept saying. "You have to find Jim." The search teams were already looking. They found pieces of the state, Route 71 scattered across the desert. The right engine was a crater. The left wing had torn completely off. The tail section had landed in a ravine 3 miles from where Bill touched down. But there was no sign of Jim. No parachute. No ejection seat. Nothing. At the hospital, doctors examined Bill with a mixture of awe and confusion. He had compression fractures in his spine, severe bruising across his entire body, frostbite on his fingers, a dislocated shoulder, broken ribs. But he was alive. By every calculation, every simulation, every understanding of human physiology, he should have been dead. The forces he experienced during that tumble through thin air should have torn him apart. "You fell from the edge of space," one doctor said quietly. "Ejecting at that speed, at that altitude. The deceleration alone should have killed you. The pressure changes should have killed you. The cold should have killed you. But here you are." Bill didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow. Jim was still missing. His friend, his crew member, the man who trusted him to bring them both home safe. Bill had failed that trust. They found Jim's body the next morning. He had gone down with the aircraft, still strapped to his ejection seat. The seat had never fired. Something in the sequence had failed. While Bill was being ripped free of the disintegrating cockpit, Jim was trapped in place, riding the burning wreckage all the way to the ground. The impact killed him instantly. Bill heard the news in his hospital bed. He turned his face to the wall and cried for the first time since he was a child. The nurses left him alone. They understood. In aviation, death is always a possibility. But that doesn't make it easier. It never makes it easier. The investigation took months. Engineers examined every piece of wreckage they could find. They interviewed Bill over and over, trying to understand exactly what had happened. The conclusion was clear. The State Route 71 had experienced a catastrophic mechanical failure. The right engine had come apart at full throttle. The violence of the explosion had destabilized the aircraft at the worst possible moment, during a high-speed turn at maximum altitude. But the real mystery was Bill's survival. Computer simulations showed that the forces he experienced during those first few seconds should have been instantly fatal. When the Blackbird broke apart, Bill was still moving at over 2,000 miles per hour. The wind blast alone generated G-forces that peaked at more than 40 Gs. Fighter pilots black out at 9 Gs. 40 Gs should have turned Bill's brain to mush inside his skull. "You became a human meteor," one engineer told him during a debriefing. "For those first few seconds, you were basically a missile. Your body was subjected to forces we can't even properly measure. You should be dead. The fact that you're sitting here talking to us is a miracle." Bill didn't believe in miracles. He believed in training and equipment and luck. His pressure suit had kept him alive. The automatic systems in his parachute had deployed when they were supposed to. And maybe, just maybe, his body had gone into shock so deep that it shut down every non-essential system, preserving his brain and heart while the rest of him was being rattled to pieces. The Air Force wanted to make him a hero. They wanted to put him on television, tell the world about the man who survived the impossible. Bill refused. He gave one interview to a military journalist and then disappeared from public view. What he had experienced wasn't heroism. It was survival. And survival without Jim felt like failure. Months passed. Bill's body healed slowly. The fractures in his spine mended. The frostbite on his fingers left permanent scars, but he could still use his hands. The bruises faded. But something inside him had broken in a way that wouldn't heal. He had nightmares about tumbling through empty sky. He woke up gasping, convinced he was still falling. Other test pilots came to visit him. Men who had pushed the envelope, who had flown faster and higher than almost anyone in history. They didn't offer sympathy. They offered understanding. "We all know the risk," one pilot said. They were sitting on Bill's porch, drinking coffee, watching the sun set over the desert. Every time we climb into one of those planes, we know we might not come back. Jim knew. You knew. That's the job. Doesn't make it easier, Bill said. No, it doesn't. The Air Force offered Bill a medical retirement. He could walk away with full benefits, full honors. He had given enough. No one would blame him if he never flew again. Bill thought about it for exactly one day. Then he reported back to duty. His commanders were surprised. His doctors were concerned. His wife was quietly supportive, even though he could see the fear in her eyes. But Bill knew that if he didn't get back in a cockpit soon, he never would. The fear would grow until it consumed him. Better to face it now, while the wounds were still fresh. They started him on simple flights, training aircraft, low and slow. Bill's hands shook the first time he pulled back on the stick and felt the wheels leave the ground. His heart was hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. But he didn't panic. He flew the pattern, landed smoothly, taxied back to the hangar. When he climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit was soaked with sweat. How was it? His instructor asked. Bill took a deep breath. Terrifying. Let's go again. Over the next year, Bill worked his way back up. Faster planes, higher altitudes. Each flight was a battle against his own mind, against the memories of tumbling through frozen sky. But he kept flying, because that's what pilots do. They fly. The State Route 71 program continued without him. The Air Force decided that Bill had pushed his luck far enough. They assigned him to other projects, safer aircraft. He didn't complain. He had seen what the Blackbird could do when everything went wrong. He had no desire to tempt fate twice. But Bill's story didn't stay secret. Word spread through the aviation community. The man who ejected at Mach 1, the human Meteor, the pilot who survived forces that should have killed him 10 times over. Other pilots asked him about it, usually late at night in quiet corners of officers' clubs. What was it like? What did you feel? Bill always gave the same answer. I felt like I was dying. And then I didn't die. That's all. He never mentioned the other part. The part he couldn't quite explain, even to himself. During those seconds of tumbling through thin air, when his brain was starved for oxygen and his body was being torn apart, he had felt strangely peaceful. Like he was watching everything happen to someone else. Like he had already left his body and was just observing from somewhere far away. The doctors said it was shock. Bill thought maybe it was something else. Maybe it was what dying felt like, right up until the moment you realize you're not going to die after all. Years later, after Bill had retired from active duty, NASA invited him to speak at a conference about high-altitude aviation. They wanted him to tell his story to a new generation of test pilots and engineers. Bill almost said no. He had spent decades trying to forget that day. But something made him change his mind. The auditorium was packed. Young faces looked up at him from his seats. Bill walked to the podium. He had notes, but he didn't need them. Some memories you can never forget no matter how hard you try. On January 25th, 1966, I ejected from State Route 71 Blackbird at 85,000 feet, he began. His voice was steady. The aircraft was traveling at Mach 3.2. For those of you who don't work in aviation, that's about 2,400 miles per hour. I survived. My backseater, Jim Zwayer, did not. The room was silent. Bill continued. People call me the human Meteor. They say I survived the impossible. But here's what I want you to understand. I didn't survive because I was special. I didn't survive because I was brave. I survived because my equipment worked and because I got lucky. That's all. Jim had the same equipment. Jim had the same training. But Jim's ejection seat failed. And that made all the difference. Bill paused. He looked out at the young faces watching him. We push the envelope because that's how progress happens. We fly faster and higher because someone has to be first. But we never forget that every flight is a risk. Every mission could be the last one. And when we lose someone, we honor them by continuing the work. We honor them by making the equipment better, the training better, the margins of safety wider. We honor them by remembering that they gave everything so that we could learn. When Bill finished speaking, there was no applause. The silence felt appropriate. Then one pilot stood up, then another. Soon the entire auditorium was on its feet. Not cheering, just standing. Acknowledging. Remembering. Bill Weaver died in 2007 at the age of 72. His obituary mentioned his long career in the Air Force, his contributions to high-altitude research, his work after retirement as a consultant and speaker. But the first line of every obituary was the same. Bill Weaver, the man who ejected at Mach 1, the human meteor, the pilot who survived the impossible. At his funeral, other test pilots spoke about his courage, his skill, his dedication. But Bill's wife shared something else. A letter Bill had written to Jim Zwayer's family shortly after the accident. In the letter, Bill apologized. He said he should have seen the warning signs earlier. He said he should have aborted the mission before the engine failed. He said he was sorry. Jim's widow had written back. Her letter was short. Jim knew the risks, she wrote. He accepted them willingly. He died doing what he loved. Please don't carry guilt for something you couldn't control. Jim wouldn't want that. Bill had carried the letter in his wallet for 40 years. It was still there when he died, creased and worn for being folded and unfolded 1,000 times. The legacy of Bill Weaver isn't just about surviving. It's about what happens after survival. How you carry on. How you honor the ones who didn't make it. How you keep flying even when every instinct tells you to stay on the ground. The State Route 71 program ended in 1990. The planes were retired, placed in museums. But the lessons learned from that aircraft, from the pilots who flew it, from the accidents and near misses and impossible survivals, those lessons continue. Every modern ejection seat contains improvements based on what engineers learned from studying Bill's accident. Every high-altitude pressure suit is better because of what happened that day in January 1966. Bill Weaver tumbled through the edge of space at 2,000 miles per hour and lived to tell about it. But his real achievement wasn't survival. It was what he did with the decades that followed. He flew, he taught, he remembered, and he made sure that Jim Zwayer's sacrifice meant something. That's the story of a human meteor. Not just a tale of impossible survival, but a reminder that in aviation, we stand on the shoulders of those who came before. Some of them lived to teach us. Some of them didn't. But all of them matter.